Good morning. In last week's gospel, Jesus came down and stood on a level place before a great multitude of people. Jesus was a storyteller, the master storyteller. This book of ours, our Christian Bible, is a beautiful collection of stories. Some are fable, some are myth, some are legend, some are allegory. Many are etiological. They're meant to explain to a humble people why things are the way they are. The most meaningful to us often are parables, the ones Jesus favored in his storytelling. Historians would tell us that there are stories in other traditions about a man being swallowed by a great fish that predate our story of Jonah. They would tell us in other traditions there are stories about a tree of knowledge that predate even our book of Genesis. This book, written by an Episcopal priest named Judy Fentress Williams, recognizes that many of our stories were created or written or handed down by oral tradition at a certain time and in a certain place and for a certain people in a specific situation. And Reverend Fentress Williams encourages us, whenever we're looking at Scripture, whenever we're reading Scripture, think of it as poetry. Think of the words as similes. Think of the words as abstract, and try to get into the message. What is the poet or the scripture writer trying to tell us? And Reverend Fentress Williams believes that we may never know exactly the message, but if we can get close, if we can use our imagination, if we can fill in the blanks between the time and the space the scripture was written in our world today with our imagination, we can get close enough. And when you're trying to be a Christian, close enough might just be good enough. So I encourage you today, as I attempt to tell a story in the tradition of our great faith, to use your imagination. Last week, Paul was struggling with the people of Corinth who were trying to get their mind around resurrection. And Paul was so frustrated. I could feel it in his reading. If you were here, you remember back and forth that Paul is trying to say, folks, resurrection is the crux of it. That's the whole deal. How can you have any pudding if you don't eat your meat? You got to believe in resurrection to be a Christian. This week, the same folks, the people of Corinth in Paul's letter, are asking, well, how are they raised? Where do they go? What do they look like? And when Father David asked me to do the sermon today and I read the readings, I knew immediately that I have a story to tell, a very deep and personal story. And I'm going to share that with you today. Maya Angelou, the wonderful poet, says there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. I've told this story only a couple of times, only to family, and today I'm going to tell it to you. Because I believe, by nature of this book, I've seen the other side. Many of you know I'm a chaplain, and I spent many years as a hospice chaplain. And this book is the Episcopal Book of Ministration to the Sick and Dying, which I've carried for 5 years. It's a little banged up. It's accompanied a lot of people on their final journey. And the story I want to tell you today addresses the question of the Corinthians centuries ago. The story begins in a nursing home in Navasota, Texas, where I began my first iteration as a chaplain, as a hospice chaplain. You know, many people, when they hear I'm a hospice chaplain out in the world, they say, oh, I could never do what you do. And I often, if they're receptive to it, we'll share with them, yes, you could, if you knew that this work takes you right to the edge. This work invites you into a sacred space. There's times I'm so close to the other side, I can feel it. I feel like Moses. I feel like I should take off my shoes. I'm not worthy. And if you knew that was coming, you could do this work. So Navasota, Texas, 5-6 years ago, I'm a brand new hospice chaplain, and I'm still learning the tools, if you will, of this trade. And one of them wasn't unlike my career before in professional sales. You have to know how to read the room. You have to know what environment you're walking into. You're looking for visual cues. Well, Bobby, the man we're going to talk about today, he made it really easy. Over top of his bed in a residential care facility was an 8-foot John Deere banner. Bobby was a farmer, and Bobby was very proud of being a farmer. Ironically, my lovely wife is telling the children the parable of the sower today upstairs as we speak. Bobby was very proud. And I'll tell you what, if you're ever in Texas, don't mistake a farmer for a rancher. Okay? Bobby was a farmer. And Bobby had a lot of beautiful stories about good years raising crops and how much he loved working the soil. And so much of Scripture talks about it, the seeds and the sower and the richness of the bounty of the earth God's provided for us. Bobby lived in that world. He loved it. And now he was in his last months. Obviously, when I met someone in that work, they were at the end. Bobby was full of stories. And more than anything, Bobby loved gospel music. Bobby taught me early in chaplaincy that even at the end, when folks can't remember names of family members and they can't remember where they worked and what they did, they remember every word of the hymns they sung in church as a child. And I started collecting those hymns on my iPhone so I could play them and sing with people. And I'm not a singer. But, I can sing along with anything, and Bobby loved to sing. And every time we got together, we'd sing a couple of hymns. And the one that we always ended with, his favorite he always wanted to sing, was Softly and Tenderly. And as a Texas farmer, he liked the Alan Jackson version. So we would sing together softly and tenderly. And I'll never forget it, the chorus every time. Come home, ye who are weary, come home. Softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling for you to come home. And Bobby would always, every time, say, that's where I'm going, Mike. I'm going home. I'm going to be with my wife. I'm going home, I'm going to be with my wife. Every single time. And then one Thursday morning, I went into Bobby's room, ready to go. We had wonderful sessions. I loved his stories. I assure you, folks, in spiritual care, pastoral care, you receive way more than you give. Just showing up sometimes is all I could do, and I walk away feeling like I've just been present with the Lord. I've just been in a sacred space. You always come away with more than you give. And I got to be honest, I loved visiting this man because it was so enriching. And one Thursday morning I walked in, I'll never forget, and Bobby just didn't look like Bobby. And I had heard from the folks I worked with, the medical professionals, that there comes a time in a dying person when you know. You just know. And Bobby is the first time I knew. I walked in and I knew. Bobby didn't want to sing. He didn't want to visit. He just said, no, it's okay. I'm going home. And I left and I called the agency I worked for and I said, hey, I think this is it. I think Bobby's going. And they were like, Bobby's been going for months. Bobby's not going anywhere. Well, they were wrong. And for the first time as a professional chaplain, I was right. And that Saturday, 2 days later, Bobby passed. And I knew because we sent a text message to the team every time someone passed, because a lot of us had a connection, and we wanted to know when someone was gone. We wanted to be prepared. So on Saturday, I got a message that Bobby had passed away. Routine text message like I would of any other patient. The following Monday, I was out in middle of nowhere, Texas, where I did my chaplain work, the country preacher, if you will, and I got a message from the agency I worked for. asking me to call Bobby's daughter because she had a message for me from Bobby. And I felt then, as I feel right now, I felt like I'm not ready to hear this message. This man died 2 days ago. How do you have a message for me from Bobby? And I never met his daughter. Oftentimes in a residential care facility, I'd have a relationship the family didn't know about. Unless I ran into them, unless there was a reason, I just spent time with the patient. And I had never met any of Bobby's family. I wasn't ready to make that phone call on that Monday morning, and I waited. I didn't do anything. On Tuesday, in middle of nowhere, Texas, I'm trying to remember the town. It wasn't Navasota, but it was one of the little towns. I pulled over into a parking lot. About 10 o'clock in the morning, I knew I had to make that phone call because I knew a family member had a message for me and that they wouldn't be complete till they shared it. And I called, and the daughter answered the phone and said, "Is this Chaplain Mike?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "I've got a message for you from my dad." And I said, "Well, gosh, what is it?" She said, "Yeah, I didn't know that you were spending so much time with him. I really appreciate the time. And I didn't know who you were, but that Saturday morning, our whole family was there in the room, and Bobby was in and out. Sometimes he'd be with us, and then he'd be gone, and we knew it was close to the end. And all of a sudden, Bobby reached out, and he grabbed my arm, and he said, "You've got to get a message to Chaplain Mike. You've got to tell Chaplain Mike it's all real. Everything we talked about is real." And that was the message from Bobby. The daughter didn't know what Bobby was talking about. I knew what Bobby was talking about. When Bobby was in and out in the room, and if you've been present with dying folks and you're a Christian, you believe this, they're back and forth with our Creator. They're back and forth with the Lord. They're getting ready to say goodbye, and they're getting ready to transition. And while Bobby was transitioning, he felt so real that he was touching heaven, that he felt it was important enough to get a message to this young upstart preacher man that it's real. So when I read the letter this week, and I see Paul continuing to wrestle with the Corinthians who don't want to believe, what's this resurrection? What are you talking about? What do you mean? How are they raised? What kind of body do they come? It's not a body, folks. It's our imagination. The line at the end of the scripture today where it says, the epistle rather, "Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we will also bear the image of the man in heaven." And I saw Bobby on the front porch of his house, sitting next to his wife, looking at a field full of crops, the bounty of his work, and probably nursing a cold glass of that sweet Texas tea that they drink down there, and knowing he did a good job. He raised crops from the earth. He lived a beautiful life. He raised a family. He loved his wife. He raised his children. And I truly believe that's where Bobby is. This sounds a lot, just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we will also bear the image of the man in heaven. That sounds strangely like on earth as it is in heaven. I believe Bobby's exactly where he thought he was going to be, and that's the message. That's the message from Bobby. I think that's the message from Paul centuries ago. We will be where we imagine being if we live that life on earth. That's the message today. Where do we want to be? Let's live that way today. God bless you.